Good evening and welcome to our public meeting. My name is Jean Richards and I am the Voter Service Vice President of the League of Women Voters of Richardson. The League of Women Voters is a non-partisan political organization which never supports or opposes candidates. If you are interested in joining the League of Women Voters of Richardson, please pick up one of our membership brochures on the table in the back right corner of the room or fill in a membership form on our website. Membership is open to women and men of all ages. Tonight's forum is being videotaped. We hope to have the unedited videotape available soon on our website. We are still working on the details. Check on our website at www.LWV-Richardson.org. You can just Google that and it will come right up. Before we begin the program this evening, we want to take a moment to honor one of our members. In addition to being active and involved in her neighborhood and the city over many decades, this woman was a charter member of the League of Women Voters of Richardson when it was founded in 1962. She has held almost every job at the local level and has also served on the board of the League of Women Voters of Texas in a number of capacities from 1993 through 1999. In addition to serving as the state budget chair, advocacy vice president, and chair of the Long Range Planning Committee, she also took on the Herculean task of serving as the redistricting issue chair for many years for the state of Texas. Her friends who served with her on the state board call her a gentlewoman and a scholar with a wry and delightful sense of humor, quite passionate about the issues that matter to her and tireless in her efforts to make a difference, and a wonderful friend and colleague who always had our backs. This member has served as a friend and mentor to many of our current league members and continues to be one of our most active and interesting members today. For her 50 years of membership in the League of Women Voters of Richardson, and for her many years of public service to this community, please join me in honoring our very own Nancy Wilson. We have here a certificate of recognition from the League of Women Voters of the United States for Nancy.
I was wondering who she was talking about. Thank you so much.
And there's that wry sense of humor. I'd also like to take a moment to address a question that arose concerning the title of tonight's forum, which is the city's current charter right for Richardson? This title was not meant to imply either criticism of the current charter nor support for it. Rather, our purpose tonight is purely educational. Over the decades since the city charter was adopted, the city itself has grown and changed, while there has been no comprehensive charter review since 1989. At our April forum, all candidates said that they are in favor of a charter review, but many members of the Richardson community are not familiar with city charters, the laws governing them, or the pros and cons of possible changes to the current charter. We hope that our speakers will clarify many of these issues so that we will all be more knowledgeable about city charters and the review process. Our moderator tonight is Karen Ellis. Karen Ellis was elected to the RISD Board of Trustees in 1999 and is recognized as a master trustee by the Texas Association of School Boards, known as TASB. In November 2006, Ellis was elected to the board of directors of TASB and is frequently called upon to testify before both House and Senate committees on education matters. She has served on the executive board of the North Texas Area Association of School Boards and is their president-elect. Additionally, she is active in both the TASB Advocacy Network and the Federal Relations Network. As a graduate of Leadership Richardson, Ellis is active in a variety of community organizations, including PTA, Richardson East Rotary Club, and the Heights Baptist Church. She attended the University of North Texas and recently retired after 20 years as an apparel representative with Leon and Associates of Dallas. Additionally, and interestingly, I never knew this and I've known her for years, she breeds champion papillons and performs with her husband as the musical duo Ellis Island. Please welcome Richardson ISD School Board Trustee Karen Ellis.
Thank you very much, Jean. I appreciate the opportunity to be here this evening. I have long respected the League of Women Voters' unbiased efforts and creating an informed public, and this is just a prime example of that tonight. Before we begin, I want to review the format for the evening. First, basics, cell phones off or silent. Any other noise-making device you have, turn that down too. Also be aware that flash photography is not allowed during the meeting itself. It's distracting to the speakers. And as Jean said, this is being videotaped and will be available in an edited format on the league website. Short, we hope. Okay, the one other basic for this evening that I do want to make clear, if you have any information about Rangers scoring, it is your responsibility to immediately share it with this entire body. Okay. Our speakers tonight are Judge Ray Noah and Dr. Robert Lowry. Judge Noah is presiding judge for the City of Richardson's Municipal Court. He is here on the left. Okay. Dr. Lowry is professor and political science program head of the School of Economic, Political, and Policy Sciences at the University of Texas at Dallas. For your convenience, a brief bio is contained in the program on each speaker. Judge Noah will speak first. He will give us about 20 minutes of background information, kind of a historical overview of city charters in general. And then Dr. Lowry will speak for about 20 minutes on the pros and cons of certain issues within the Richardson City Charter. Then I'll ask questions for the speakers to answer. The questions have either been submitted online earlier or this evening via the little yellow cards that you have received. All questions must be on a yellow card. If you need one, please raise your hand and the tellers will get a card. Here's a teller, for example, visualize if you will. She will get a card to you. One question per card, please, and write legibly. We really do want to ask your question. Your questions may be addressed to one or both speakers. Questions submitted by email prior to tonight have been transcribed to yellow cards. All questions will receive the same consideration. And when you have written a question on a yellow card, raise it up and our teller will deliver it to the screeners table. The screeners table. The question screeners are seated here beside me. They're volunteers from the League of Women, which often happens, they vote often in the winter. Volunteers from the League of Women Voters of Richardson. The screeners are grouping questions by topic to avoid repetition. And they are screening the questions according to the League of Women Voters of Texas Guide for Candidate Forums. It's a very good guide. The timekeeper is from the League and seated on the front row. Timekeeper will signal the speakers with signs marked 1 minute, or 30, or will indicate by hand when they're getting close. Indicating how much time remains to answer the question. This is being done in an effort to keep the meeting moving and so we can get to all questions. So, is everyone comfortable with that? We're good to go? All right, then let's begin. Local government, local self-government is the cornerstone of a democratic society, and it's critical to a dynamic community such as Richardson. So, Judge Noah, will you start us off and give us some background history on city charters, please?
I'll try to do that. First of all, let me say thank you for the opportunity to be here this evening, and it's a pleasure to see so many, correctly said, old friends. Some of you I have not seen for a long time, even though we even had discussions of the Richardson Charter for many years. The charter that we have, I guess, is something that started in the 1920s when cities suddenly realized that the average elected official really was not necessarily competent to run a city or a town or a took time away from their own work, and oftentimes things were left undone.
A little louder with the mic closer, please.
Okay, I don't know that Cynthia will appreciate that. I'm supposed to talk in a low tone. Can you hear me now? Okay, that's one of the ladies that I've known since she was a teenager and got started in the league. But anyway, we've grown. I have my hearing aids on. Do you? But getting back to where I was, they discovered really and truly that the average elected official did not have the talents, plural, that it took to put together a system. When you didn't have a water system, and you didn't have a sewage system, and you didn't have building codes, and you didn't have a whole lot of things, a city was not that difficult, even though as they grew much larger, that's the approach they began to take. And that was called Home Rule City. The state of Texas passed a statute that enabled the cities of 5,000 or more in the city of Texas to come together, sign a petition, describe the metes and bounds description of the geographic area that was included, and to hold an election and to adopt a home rule charter. So what we're here quickly to talk about this evening, from my standpoint, is the home rule charter. Richardson's home rule charter was put together in 1956. And by the way, there's a fellow out there that was on some of the first elected officials as a result of that 1956 charter. And at the same time, the people decide what form of government they want within the charter. There are probably 2 or 3 different well-defined ways that this happens. One of them would be what's called the strong mayor system. And in the strong mayor system, there's direct election of the mayor. And the charter defines the scope of authority that the mayor has, what he can and cannot do, and how, in many instances, he has to interact with the other members of the elected body. A second one is called the council manager, or the weak mayor form of government, and that's when the government is left to much like a board of directors as to how many councilmen they choose to elect by what purpose. In our case, as you know, it's 7. There's several cities in the near term who start out with 5 and then go to 7 or 8 or 9 or 15 even, as they might in some of the larger cities, as is required to meet the needs of the city to provide representation. Tonight, one of the other speakers will be devoting a great deal of attention to the merits of how those things occur. But the political process is managed more by the type of government that you have as to whether it's the council or the strong mayor form. Now, it's true that you can deviate from either of those, or you can bring the attributes that you desire as a given group of public into a charter. And that's the governing body, controlling device that has been created by the citizens of that community. As time goes on, things change, and the responsibilities change. But in almost every city of any consequence or size, you have a city manager. And when you review the charter, look at it, you discover that the city manager, which was the primary reason for the home rule charter anyway, is the one who is actually responsible for the operation of the city. It's not the council. It's not the mayor. It's not the mayor and the council. It's the city manager. Most charters contain provisions which say they can't interfere with the job that the city manager has. And so the charter itself defines the relationship of the city manager with the council and the mayor, depending on which type of these you have, and what his responsibilities are and what his authority is. And who hires and fires? Most of the time, not all of the time, but most of the time, the city manager has the chief financial officer working for him, but not the general counsel. Generally speaking, the general counsel works for the mayor and the council by whatever form they have. Even though in larger cities, even around us here, they occupy a position as an employee of the city. Richardson does not do that. Richardson has the city attorney appointed, but it's a single individual who is the city attorney, and they provide the legal service necessary to the city based on the needs of both the city manager and the mayor and the council. The mayor in our city is chairman of the board, elected by the members of the board, who are elected, of course, by the general public to their place 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Then they decide among themselves who should be the leader. The next thing that I think it's important for you to know that the charter defines the way the meetings operate also. You got into a serious question here not too long ago about the open meetings, how you could make decisions and what was required. And they found that there was something that had been neglected. The assumption had always been that the state law would override the city charter, and that's true, unless the charter provision is more strict than the law that's passed by the city, which means it more than qualifies for the state trying to cause happen. From time to time, this city, as other home rule cities, will have a charter review. There have been 2 or 3 of those over the years here in Richardson. Some have resulted in the determination that changes should be provided to the electorate for them to determine how they want themselves to be governed and how they want matters to be resolved from that governing standpoint. And those provisions can be done, and once they're voted on and approved, they become the way in which the city functions. If they are turned down, then the city continues to function as it has with regard to those issues and continues on until the next time that the issues may come up. Now, there isn't any question that time changes everything. You know, there was an interesting time here in Richardson when all the water came from a water tower over behind the Greenville Avenue and Apollo Road. And that was supposed to provide all the water that would be necessary for this community. How many of you would like to bet on that? Or that one fire station and one fire truck would be enough? Or that 3 police vehicles would be sufficient to cover the area? And as these things grow, so do the way in which they interrelate and function change. Those things, again, that charter are delegated under normal conditions to the city's manager. So, quickly to summarize, the city is definitely run administratively by the city manager in the home rule charter. That's what it says. That's the way all of them are. Some of them are higher or lower profile depending upon who they are. In the city of Richardson, you currently have the 3rd city manager that the city has ever had. Bob Sherrill, Bob Huey, and Bill Keller, in that order. So you've got long tenure, you've got consistent tenure, and you have a certain variety of things that have continued to occur under the charter control of the way in which the city is managed and run. Now, in the case of the city council, which came into position in '56, I don't know, have a clue about how many mayors and council people you've had, but there have been a sufficient number. The charter and the council call out for court, call out for, as I told you before, the general counsel. They call out for auditors, they call out for treasurers, and they also call out for those boards and commissions which are necessary to include the general public and to comply with the legal process most often defined in the charter with regard to the relationship of the police department, the fire department, all of the things that we know and see those are the purview, if you will, of the city manager. Again, to summarize, there was a term that came out a few years ago, a contract. This is a contract that the people have entered into with themselves to describe, define the way in which they will be governed. It can be amended by those same people. It can be kicked into action by the act of the council, placing an issue before the general public. It can be enacted by charter review committee, which the council can then look at and take certain or all of the issues they may provide to the public for change. Or there's the other way in which a petition containing the wording of what would be amended and put it to the voters as a result of this petition. It's, I believe, 20,000 people, 5%, whichever is smaller. And so that petition would mandate them to be placed to the voters as well. There are, as I hope I've indicated to you, it's not always a simple matter to change a given paragraph in the charter. Certain things are interrelated, and so if changes are made, it generally is in the best interest of the community to have the charter reviewed as opposed to a single item. It frequently creates conflicts, and those are the things that I think we have. As to whether the charter is the right document as you have it today for the city of Richardson, that's pretty much up to you to make a determination as to what will happen with regard to the charter. But remember, it's your contract with yourself and defines how you'll be governed.
Thank you, Judge. That gives us a better understanding of the process and how it works. Let's bring it a little closer to home now. Dr. Lowry, I know you've familiarized yourself with Richardson's charter. Can you give us some of the pros and cons, perhaps, that you see there on the issues?
Thank you. Yeah, first, thanks for inviting me here. It's an interesting opportunity for me to see whether the stuff that I read in the journals and try to teach to my graduate students has any relevance and makes any sense to anybody else. I was asked to talk specifically about 4 possible changes, which would be the possibility of having single-member districts for electing the council, direct election of the mayor, term limits, and also staggered terms. And so I'm going to talk about those and one other that doesn't exhaust all the possibilities. In particular, one thing that doesn't include is altering sort of the fundamental nature of the manager's position. And to some extent, if that stays as it is, this other stuff will have maybe limited impact on day-to-day operations. So if someone wants to open that during the questions, we can maybe talk about that a little too. But one beginning remark that Judge Noah already kind of made is that the effects of these kinds of changes that I'm going to talk about, really the answer is it depends. Because a lot of times it depends on whether you're making one change in isolation or various combinations. Sometimes it doesn't make a lot of sense to even think about one of these issues unless you're doing something else. Other times it may make sense, but exactly how it plays out depends on what else, if anything. And so there's really kind of 2 classic bundles of rules in municipal government going back historically. As again the judge mentioned, one is the strong mayor system, although really going all the way back, it's sort of known as the machine-style system because it's associated with machine-style politics in large cities in the Northeast and the Midwest. And that's where you basically have single-member districts to elect the council, partisan elections, a strong independently elected mayor, and no manager, going back to like the 19th century. The executive functions report directly to the mayor. And the idea is much like the U.S. national government. You separate the legislative and the executive branches, and the chief executive runs the executive branch. The other opposite is what's called reform style, because it came into vogue with the progressive movement around the turn of the 20th century. And it basically consists of at-large elections, nonpartisan elections, council manager system, and then the mayor often is selected by the council, sometimes yes, sometimes no. And that actually is, I mean, Richardson has pretty close to a pure reform style system, which is popular in the South and the West, and generally in sort of mid-sized cities around the country. The only real difference here is that 4 of the 7 council members are elected from districts, although they're still elected in citywide votes, which is why I say it's almost a pure reform style system. So to sort of take the changes, I think the first one I want to talk about, because it might be the most fundamental, is this issue of possibly having single member districts. And there's, you know, well, first of all, there are, again, a lot of sort of hybrids if you look around. Dallas has a council manager system with an independently elected mayor, single member districts, but still nonpartisan elections. So it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And one reason for the single member districts, and again, a large part of the reason Dallas has them, is if you have a minority, whether it's a racial minority, an ethnic minority, an economic minority, or whatever, that is geographically concentrated, having single member districts is a way to try to guarantee them representation on the council. So if you have some group that's 20% of the population, and everybody's running in at-large elections, chances are nobody is going to, and if the voting breaks down according to majority-minority lines, which is always an if, nobody from the minority group is going to get elected. But if they're geographically concentrated and you create a district, they can have their own representative. Now there's also a debate here in the academic literature about sort of the difference between symbolic and substantive representation and whether there might even be a trade-off. You know, the argument is, okay, suppose you've got, say, 7 districts, and a minority that is concentrated in 2 of them, and you've got issues breaking down along minority-majority lines. If you do it this way, you'll have 2 minority representatives, 5 majority representatives, and every time there's a vote that breaks down on those lines, it'll go 5-2, and the minority wins nothing. And so the argument is that you might be better off substantively to maintain at-large elections, because if the minority bloc is large enough that they can be sort of the swing voters or to influence the outcome of the at-large election, everybody running has to pay at least some attention to their substantive interests. So, and again, typically in places like Dallas and now Irving and other places around Texas, that is debated in terms of racial and ethnic lines, and people go to court about it and this sort of thing. But really, I mean, the outcome and how it's going to affect events sort of breaks down on how large the minority group is. Is it big enough to at least have an influence in an at-large election? How geographically concentrated are they? Because if they're not concentrated, single-member districts won't make any difference for representation. And then sort of the relative importance of symbolic versus substantive representation. Some people think it's important to have symbolic representation, even if it doesn't make any difference on the ultimate decisions. Just to say, look, we've got a more diverse council that represents and that looks like the population of the city. The other sort of effect of single-member districts, and that's related to that, is that it means each member is accountable not to the whole city, but only to a certain part of it. And that, again, can have sort of pros and cons. One pro would mean that they have to look out for the interests of that particular district. The people who live in that district have somebody they can go to and they can say, you know, you are our representative. And oftentimes there are things they can do that don't even need a council vote. You know, it goes under the heading of constituency service. And so even if you don't have enough votes to influence the outcome of a council-wide vote, you still got a minority representative on the council who you can go through for constituency services and these other sort of more informal things. But at the same time, it means that those people tend to focus on the interests of their district and not the whole. Kind of a problem people have with the House of Representatives these days. Everybody's worried about their district and not the national interest, and you'd have the same thing at the local level. And you can even get to the point where people get set up as sort of having their own little fiefdoms, and they're sort of the boss of District 7 or the boss of District 3, and they sort of run things as their own, and that's sort of why it's associated with machine-style politics, because everybody's got their own little machine. So it can go that way. So there's a lot of pros and cons, and that's kind of why I say that might be the most the most fundamental change that you might consider of the ones I'm talking about. Again, you've got 4 council members coming from districts, but as long as they're all elected in citywide elections, I think it's just a fundamentally different thing. So the second issue is direct election of the mayor. And here, my first comment is, well, it depends on whether you have nonpartisan at-large election of the council or whether you have single-member district and/or partisan elections. If you go to single-member districts, I think most people would say you should have a mayor because that means you've got at least one directly elected mayor, because that means at least the mayor is accountable to the entire city. Although it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. The British House of Commons is elected in districts, and the Prime Minister is not elected by the whole country. They're elected from one, usually very safe district. But the thing that holds that system together is it's partisan elections and it's very strong partisan discipline. And the reason the Prime Minister looks out for the whole country is they're worried about how their party is going to do in the next elections all over the place. So if you want to have partisan elections, then maybe you might want to, you could have a mayor and not have them directly elected and have districts. On the other hand, if you stick with nonpartisan elections and districts for council, then there's a very strong argument for directly electing the mayor so that you have a citywide constituency. If you stick with at-large elections for the council, having a separately elected mayor doesn't seem like it would make all that much difference because everybody's still elected at the same time, citywide, by the same set of voters. But I can think of a couple of things where it might make a difference. One is when you have the mayor elected by the other council members, it becomes sort of an insider's game, and it's the chairman of the board is the term that was used. And so, I don't know Richardson's history enough, so I don't know, how fair this is, but I would guess it's been very rare that a rookie member of the council got elected mayor. You basically have to get on, and you have to get to know the other people, and you get to work with them, and you become friends with them, and you get your support there, and they elect you as mayor. And that has, again, sort of good aspects because it means the council clearly supports whoever's the mayor, but it also means it could devolve into sort of a good old boys and girls club where it's very difficult for an insurgent candidate to really get elected and make much headway. And whereas if the mayor was separately elected, even if it's at the same time, and even if it's all citywide, as long as they could maybe put together a different constituency out of the pieces of the city than everybody else, you could get someone who really is out to make some significant changes in the system. Although again, as long as you keep the city manager, how significant those changes could ever be is up for question. The other sort of subtle distinction it might make is on the dynamics of the council itself. Again, now if you have a set of council members and somebody's mayor, and one of the other council members thinks, I'd like to be mayor, what they're trying to do is work to create a good impression among the other council members. And so they make friends and they do things that impress the other council members. If you've got somebody who's on the council who thinks, I'd like to be mayor after the next election, and it's a separate election, and they're planning to run for that spot, then their strategy is very different. They've got to start maybe doing things that's going to get their name out in front of the voters and to distinguish them from the current mayor in the voters' eyes. And so that could really kind of change the whole dynamics of how the council operates. So my basic answer on direct election of the mayor is it depends a lot on what other changes, if any, are made. Let me talk just a second about partisan elections. That's not one I was asked to, but again, that's one of the fundamental distinctions typically between these sort of two polar cases. Again, nonpartisan elections are very common at the local level in Texas. Their partisan elections are very common in some other parts of the country. It may seem like something you don't want to have, and again, that was one of the big tenets of the progressive movement. Is their basic theory was they wanted to make things based on objective expertise as much as possible instead of politics. So they were very opposed to partisan elections. On the other hand, I've lived in 6 different states, if you count Washington, D.C. Texas is the first place I ever lived that had partisan elections for judge. Why some offices and not others, I'm not really sure. But partisan elections, again, would create this case where you've got different allies and different coalitions within the council And that might thought to be not such a good thing. One possible clear advantage of partisan elections at the local level, though, is that local elections are very low information elections. I mean, most people who don't belong to the League of Women Voters probably have no clear idea who the candidates are, or at least very little, unless they're the incumbents, and they might have heard of them before. But it means it's very, very difficult for a challenger to run against an established incumbent. And again, given such low information, it's not clear exactly what sways voters' decisions. If you put a partisan label on it, that's one very important piece of information. Even if they don't know anything else, it tells them something. And so that's usually the argument for why you should have partisanship in local elections, is it gives them a little bit of information, it sort of reduces the incumbent advantage a little bit, and structures the elections a little bit more. So the other two issues were staggered terms and term limits. Again, staggered terms, which I guess would mean going from 2-year terms to 4-year terms, and then having sort of roughly half the council elected every 2 years. Or if you had a separately elected mayor, you have maybe 3 council members every 2 years, and then the mayor once every 4 years or something. Again, I think it's fairly simple what the pros and cons are. I mean, the pro is that you have the increased continuity. You're guaranteed to have somebody in office who's been there and done that before. Again, I'm not really familiar with the history of the Richardson Council to know sort of how long people tend to stay in office. Although I know that only 2 of the current 7 members are on more than their second term. Were elected before 2009, so there seems to be, at least recently, a fair amount of turnover. By staggering the terms, you're again sort of guaranteed to have a combination of maybe newcomers and oldcomers. But on the other hand, it also means that things are more stable, which you can say is a good thing. But if there's something going on, some reason you want to see sort of rapid turnover in the council, that makes it much more difficult to achieve. And of course, that's the classic distinction between the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House, you go all the way back to the Federalist Papers, was supposed to be the pulse of the nation's opinion. And the Senate, even now that it's directly elected, changes much more slowly, and it tends to be the brakes that are put on the system. With only one chamber in the City Council, you kind of got to decide which model is better, but that would be sort of the main effects of staggering. Term limits is another interesting and kind of complex issue. I started thinking about this and I realized I have no very good idea how common term limits are at the local level. Dallas has them, I know that much, but it's not an issue that has really been thought of that much even in the literature in terms of local government. Of course, term limits, for president have been around since right after World War II. A lot of governors are term limited. At the state legislative level, there was what academics like to call a natural experiment in the 1990s. Up until the 1990s, there was not a single state in the country that had legislative term limits. In the course of about 4 years, almost half the states adopted them. Some have since had second thoughts, but we're now still in a situation where we've got about a third of the states with legislative term limits and 2/3 without them. And of course, this has been subject of a lot of research recently. So we think we know a little bit about what effect they have at state legislatures. I'm not sure how well that'll translate to a city council. The justification at the state level was sort of twofold. One was, again, this sort of discontent with incumbency advantage, where once somebody got in the state legislature and they had some name recognition and they could raise money, it seemed almost impossible for a challenger to beat them. And then secondly was just the notion that we should get away from having professional politicians, and if you have term limit, you get these citizen politicians who will go in, serve a few years, and then go back to their other jobs. And so, of course, this was a bigger issue in states that had professionalized legislatures that meet year-round. When it was in Texas, it doesn't have it. It's an amateur legislature and only meets once every other year. But what the literature has found out is that it is not done away with the career politicians. Basically, what it just does is change the career path. Somebody gets elected to the legislature, they serve as long as they can, and at the sort of the start of their last term, they immediately start thinking about where they're going to run for their next election. So they still have that electoral motive, but it's not clear how it works is it depends on whether they're thinking about running next. As far as the incumbency advantage, and again, it's a little bit odd. What it does is it means that every few years you're forced to have an open seat for every district. But in the other years, there tends to be very little competition because people say, well, why run against an incumbent when I'm probably going to lose? If I know that seat's going to be open 2 years from now or 4 years from now, I'll just wait my time, and then everybody runs for the open seat. And in the intervening years, you don't get a lot of political competition for individual seats. What it has done is basically weaken the legislature relative to other parts of state government, relative to the governor, the bureaucracy, the lobbyists, just about everybody. Because again, you don't have people who have been there for a long time, who have the opportunity to stay there and make their entire career out of becoming Speaker of the House or that sort of thing. An extreme case is Michigan, which has a professional legislature that has adopted 6-year term limits for the House. So basically what that means is if you run for the House, your first 2 years you're trying to fund the bathroom, your second 2 years you're doing your job and plotting to run for Speaker of the House, and your third 2 years you're looking for your next job. And just very rapid turnover, and the influence of the legislature has really probably declined relative to other institutions and actors. But the question is, how does that translate? How do those findings, and do those findings translate to the local level? You don't have a professional council; it's not a full-time job. I don't know enough about the history to know whether the issue of people staying on the council for years and years and years is really anything anybody's concerned about. Right now, there seems to have been a fair amount of turnover in recent years. The other reason, again, to think about doing it would be if there seems to be not enough competition and an incumbent advantage. But there again, you have this sort of odd effect that what it does is it creates forced competition periodically, and in between, it might actually create less competition because people are just waiting for the seat to come open again. So I guess my impression is unless somebody thinks there's a real problem with people staying on too long or something, there's not a very strong case to be made for term limits in a local level, at least in sort of a moderate-sized city. Again, Dallas has a different situation. Big city, more of a full-time job, although I know some of the council members there do have outside jobs as well. But sort of the closer you get to a full-time professional career type position, the stronger the argument gets for having term limits. So again, those are the things that I have prepared to talk about. Again, I think that really a much more fundamental change would be altering the relationship between the manager and the council. But that's something that someone wants to ask about. I can take a stab at, or I'll see what else people are interested in.
Okay, great. Thank you, gentlemen. We appreciate your insights, your research on this. We do have some questions, and I think without further ado, we'll just go ahead and start tackling some of these. The first, and this is for both of you, what is the relationship power of the city manager? And how might that change with a new charter?
I think you're much better qualified to talk about what it is now.
Well, you don't know this, but
Get right in the mic.
I'm sorry. I don't understand how you can't hear me. All right, I'm trying. I'm sorry. Right now, the relationship, as I detected, between the manager and the council is pretty much as I addressed it in my remarks. Now, speaking to you, I served as mayor from 1968 through 1983. And we went from Bob Sherrill, the first city manager we ever had, to the second, who was still there when I left. And was followed then by a mayor who served 2 terms, followed by a mayor who served 2 terms, followed by a mayor who served 10 terms. In round figures, I think that's correct. So there's some longevity here and consistency. And during that same period of time, we're blessed, if you will, and we have been blessed with good, strong, effective city management. One of the things that we have both not said to you is there is a necessity for that type of strength among the professional categories because of the number of things which happen, but they don't happen here. They happen at the North Texas Council of Governments. They happen at the RTC. They happen in Austin, where a professional approach and longevity is the key. You have to get in line in so many different places for things to happen, to give the community the board stroke that it needs to make things happen on a statewide, countywide, region-wide basis. And so with the type of management that you have that. All of our city managers have been very strong in their statewide, very respected head of their associations, which is important also. And it gives continuity, if you will, with the elected officials in Austin, as well as in Washington. The same thing is true of people on the council. For them to be successful in these other arenas, where a lot of what we have to do happens, that gives you the opportunity for them to be chairman or secretary or treasurer, or whatever it takes, in order to have something to say that's meaningful in the arts. So the city benefits greatly from the longevity and the professionalism of the manager, as well as the members of the council in the period of time in which they're there, and including the mayor, because most of the time the jobs that I'm talking about are passed around, because there's only so many hours in a day, but there are a lot more hours to be spent. So,
Dr. Lowry, would you like to address it?
Yes, a couple of points. Yeah, I think one of the council manager, the whole council manager system, is more common in sort of the south and western newer cities, but it's also more common in mid-sized cities. And I think that's largely because of the role of the manager. And in a small town, it's not really big enough to require or pay for a full-time professional manager. In a big city, the mayor is a full-time professional job, and they've got staff, and the council has staff, and all this sort of thing. But in sort of mid-sized communities, you need someone who's professional, who's got longevity and experience. But the elected officials are more likely to be sort of part-time. And so, for a city like Richardson, having that manager in there to fulfill that function is probably very important. The potential, I guess, where it might get out of whack, and here again, if you think about the analogy of a board of directors for a corporation, is and it comes down really to how good the council is at oversight, and being informed about what the manager does, but also respecting the line between their functions and the manager's function. And if that's done well, then there's probably, that system probably works well. You have a certain amount of political accountability when it's needed, but you also have someone with the expertise and the connections and the longevity to really handle things day to day and that go on at the state level and regional level and that sort of thing.
Okay, thank you. The next question, well, actually, a report, top of the third, 0-0. In a weak mayor system, and if you know Richardson in particular, what duties or responsibilities does the mayor have compared to a councilman? Both of you.
I can tell you what he really does.
Give him the microphone, Judge.
Here we go. Better? I'm sorry about that, y'all. The mayor really is the chairman of the board. He directs the meetings. He calls the questions. He controls the crowd to some degree. He cuts the ribbons, kisses the babies, reads the proclamations, does the politically correct thing. And let me say this, he does it for the city and for the council, not for himself. Now, there are ways that, of course, that can be changed, particularly if the mayor that you have is looking to run for governor or some other office. I mean, those things get out of whack, but during my tenure here, that has not been much of a problem. But the weak part of this is that the council makes all of the appointments. The mayor makes none. The mayor can't even make a motion. So it doesn't matter as he sets up there what he'd like to do. It's what the council makes the motion to do that makes it happen. Now, we all know that the mayor has his own tools, right? And he has his own way of causing things to happen, and that's by organizing, directing, and leading, and helping things to happen that the council wants to happen. And that gives the continuity. I can tell you from experience, it has not always been 7-0 in Richardson, Texas. There have been a lot of times it was 5-2 and 4-3. Luke 9 that's out there, for example, when it was voted on was 4-3. So not all the progressive things, as some of us might have seen them, were unanimously elected by the council. And of course, DART is the same thing. That, on the other hand, was unanimously voted on by the council, and those things happen. So what I'm trying to do is indicate some of the regional things and some of the bigger things that the council is involved in. And the mayor doesn't have anything to do with them that the council won't direct him to do.
Yeah, I think just in general, the most important distinction is what powers, if any, the mayor has to make appointments and to have people report directly to them rather than the council as a whole. In a weak mayor system, the council makes the appointments and the reporting is to the council. A strong mayor system, the mayor may have people more personally responsible with them. And that's just the basic distinction.
Okay, thank you. This question addresses the Texas Constitution. What does it say about the popular election of the city mayor?
What does it say about population?
About the popular election of a city mayor.
Well, I don't know that it's all in the Constitution. A lot of it has to do with what the legislature.
Judge Nada, please get in the
What the
microphone.
legislature has enacted in the form of law more so than what the Constitution says. Because from the Constitution, the legislature has basically identified the home rule system and given the local community the opportunity to make up its mind what it wants to do with that regard and to effect it in the charter. So that's a permissive thing that the legislature has derived, if you will, from the Constitution and granted to the people to govern themselves.
Sir, we cannot do that right now. Thank you. In fairness to the questions that are being asked.
The answer was incorrect.
Thank you. Would you put that on a card and we'll use the same format that we're using for the other questions? Thank you. Go ahead.
This issue was on a blog that we got an email about. So in my online research of the Texas Constitution, the section on municipal corporations says that if you have a system where there are people elected to both 2- and 4-year terms, all of the members of the governing body have to be elected. Period. And does that mean if the mayor is elected as a member of the council, they've been elected? And I guess the question is, does that mean that they then have to be separately elected as mayor? The literal words don't seem to say that. So unless there's something that the legislature's done, it looks to me like, again, based on some very quick research, that that's not the case.
Okay, thank you. This question, it says only one city in the state of Texas with a population greater than 50,000 selects the mayor through the city council. Is that, A, do we know if that's fact? And the question is, when will the citizens of Richardson be given the chance to vote for mayor? that becomes a charter issue. Correct?
If I read what we're doing here, we're not.
Would you use the microphone, sir?
We're not, neither of us is sitting here on the hot seat as to whether there should or should not be an election in Richardson, Texas. Nor are we here to pass judgment on whether or not the mayor should be directly elected or whether there should be a single member district. We're here to talk about the charter that we have and the issues that the gentleman that's brought up that he talked directly about. We're not, as I know it, unless you want us to express personal opinion or do a lot more research. We're not in the position of having to defend or not defend whether you directly elect the mayor, whether you have single member districts or any of those things. So that's not what we're here for.
Correct. Yes, sir.
I don't know whether the statement about cities greater than 50,000 is true or not, given how fast cities in Texas grow. It might be true yesterday and false tomorrow. I can see though why you would be more likely to have directly elected mayors in large cities, and again, it depends on the combination of other things. Larger cities are more likely to have heterogeneous populations with distinct majority and minority interests and possibly geographic concentration, which leads to single member districts, which leads possibly to a separately elected mayor so that you have someone elected citywide. So that's one reason I could certainly see why you would be more likely to do that in larger cities. As to, you know, what the status is and where the cutoff is in Texas now, I have no idea.
And for changes to be made, according to what we are hearing, it would be a charter revision issue. Okay. This question, and we have more questions on the way. Okay. This question, can the council create resolutions or ordinances that change parts of the charter and or statute?
The answer to that is yes and no. And let me explain what I'm trying to say here. The answer is no. They are controlled by the charter. If they act outside of the permissive capability that they have within the scope of the charter, then that's an invalid act on their part. The example of that comes up, as we mentioned earlier, with regard to the way the charter read on open meetings. The charter read one way, that all decisions would be made in public, which meant that it applied also to boards and commissions and everything down the line. The law changed and defined public meetings and what could and could not be in public meetings. Assumption, as I told you, was that the change in the law by the state had an impact on the charter. The city was moving along under the law change when suddenly they discovered that the charter was more restrictive than they had violated the charter, and so a correction had to be made. That's kind of an example of saying yes and no. But they also have the ability through the administrative actions of the charter to pass resolutions with regard to those things which don't really change the charter, but are permissive within the terms of the charter itself.
I don't think I have much to add to that. I mean, the council can't formally change the charter itself. But it leads, you know, obviously there's lots of leeway to do things one way or another, and that's about it. I don't know if the question was, can you vote on individual amendments to the charter as opposed to having to put the entire charter up for a vote?
It can the council create resolutions or ordinances that change parts of the charter and or statute?
Not by itself. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for clarifying. This question addresses the power of the city manager. Would term limits increase the power of the city manager?
Yes. Yeah, like I said, I think that is sort of the one thing that's clear in the academic research on term limits. Is unless they're so long that they don't really bite anyway, they basically decrease the power of the legislative body relative to the executive, the bureaucracy, pretty much everybody, the interest groups.
Okay, thank you. As you have become familiar with Richardson's charter, what is obsolete or dead wood in the current city charter by today's standards?
Well, I'm not familiar with the details, all the details of the charter. So I guess I'm not sure if anything is. If Richardson continues to grow, although since it's landlocked, I don't know how much it will. Certain provisions might become obsolete, but nothing that really jumps to mind.
I guess I'd have to say, you'd have to look at the charter with that in mind, not just the general appearance, the general approach to the charter that we use in preparation for tonight. There's probably some dead wood in there.
I can think of one thing, just in glancing at it initially, because we've addressed it from a school board stance as well, and that's where I'll notice any change in the charter has to be posted in the newspaper. Well, today's communication is much broader than just the newspaper. Communication is online and all that. So that is an update factor that could be addressed. That's a simple thing, but so there are things that are there, most likely. Okay, how have any academics or organizations developed model city charters? If so, how does the Richardson City Charter compare?
Well, I'm sure some have. Perhaps the National League of Cities, some others as well. Like I said, the Richardson, the broad outlines of the Richardson Charter are pretty close to the classic reform style government. So I would say any model charter that takes that reform approach, the Richardson Charter is going to be quite close to it. Not 100% of people support the reform style approach, but that would be one model that's out there, and the Richardson Charter is really very close to a pure example of that.
Judge, any comment? Any comment?
There are models. You're right. I mean, there are model charters. Among the lawyers over the years, they have those who practice the kind of law and help in those things. They have siphoned off things in such a form that there is, I don't know what you call it, a model charter, but the files contain pretty much the same information no matter which city or which lawyer is going to be involved in putting together the charter. That's the way those things come about. They exchange the information, Texas Municipal League and National League of Cities. Of course, the National League of Cities, I think, does have a model charter. Texas Municipal League, no doubt, has the same type of things because there are cities that are adopting charters, as you said, all the time. And particularly in this area, some of these cities have grown up. I can remember when Addison was just 3 people sitting over there wanting to do with a vacant schoolhouse. That's certainly changed today, and they do in fact have a charter.
Thank you. Richardson is a very well-run city and has done a very solid job of weathering some tough economic situations, not of its own making. Like the dot-com bust, the bankruptcy of Nortel due to trusting Bernie Ebers and MCI, the largest business fraud in the history at that time, and finally the financial crisis of 2008, a global issue. Richardson has survived all this in reasonable fashion. Is there any evidence, any changes to the current charter would have allowed Richardson to survive any of this in a better fashion?
None that I know of. I mean, I don't know how much any of those things were really within the control of the city council. Here again, different municipal governments perform different functions. I mean, the council here seems to be fairly limited in the scope of its functions. It's sort of basic city services and economic development. So obviously, I don't know if anything like single-member districts might have changed the economic development. There might be some distributional issues there. But for example, the school board is independent, which isn't the case in every city. There's, I think, very little in the way of redistributive social services done by the city, which isn't the case in New York City. So, you know, the way that the council charter and the structure affects outcomes depends to some degree, a lot maybe, on the scope of the functions, and they seem to be fairly limited here.
Well, I'm not even sure that the charter addresses some of the issues that come up in the process of economic development. For example, to bring it to home, when the council was involved in the legislative activity for the creation of UTD, nothing about the charters involved in the process at all whatsoever. Same thing is true with what you do when you're in Austin or wherever you perform your function, either one as a city manager or two as a councilman or the mayor. If you're working for the economic betterment of the community, that's not addressed per se, as far as I know, in the charter. It's a purpose, it's a job, it's a goal, it's an objective, and those are the tactics that are used to make those things happen. And this city has done it very, very well, as have some other cities. Frisco's done it well. Irving's done it well. Dallas does it well. But none of that's defined by the charter. It's the work that the manager and the council and the Chamber of Commerce and the community itself do in order to make these things happen.
Thank you. I have 3 questions here that are very similar, and so I'm going to combine them. How often should a city review its charter? If the city were to undertake a review of the city charter, how would they go about it?
How often? I don't know. Thomas Jefferson said we should rewrite the national constitution once every generation. 12 to 16 years, somewhere in that range might be a decent guess. It's been 1989 was the last time, so 22 years. A little less than that, maybe, I don't know, but not drastic. Not every 2 years or every 4 years. Because the whole thing about a charter is it's the fundamental governing institution of the city, and what distinguishes that from other kinds of laws and rules is that it is intended to be in place for a long time, and it's hard to change. And so you shouldn't be reviewing it every time you turn around. But at the same time, you know, there should be at least occasional review. And here again, I have to confess, I don't know what the actual mechanism is for putting a charter to a vote.